welcome to this MED virtual event. Today we host a conversation on Saudi Arabia, its regional foreign policy and diplomacy, trying to make sense of Riyadh's position since October 7, the Hamas attack against Israel, and the start of the Israel-Hamas war, with the purpose to understand the security and economic implications of the war for the Saudi regional strategy. I'm Eleonora Ardemagni, Senior Associate Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and this panel is part of ISPI Mediterranean Dialogues 2023, promoted by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and ISPI. Well, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, who are two distinguished experts of the region and particularly of Saudi Arabia. So my warm welcome to Tobias Bork. Dr. Bork is a Senior Research Fellow for Middle East Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute in London, with expertise on the foreign, defense, and security policies of the Arab states, with particular regard to the Gulf monarchies. I would like to mention the book Dr. Bork has recently published, Seeking Stability Amidst Disorder, the Foreign Policy of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, 2010-2020. So to analyze the previous decade that was really different from the year of de-escalation we assisted since 2020. And welcome also to Yasmin Farouk. Dr. Farouk is a non-resident scholar for the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and also non-resident at Baker Institute, Rice University, with a specific focus on Saudi Arabia and its foreign policy. I would like to remember the most recent article Dr. Farouk wrote on Saudi Arabia as part of a Carnegie collection titled Arab Perspectives on the Middle East Crisis. The Israel-Hamas war complicates a lot Saudi Arabia's regional strategy, a strategy which is completely built upon Vision 2030 and post-oil diversification goals. As you know, the Saudis put on ice the normalization process with Israel because of the conflict, but they haven't closed the door to Israel so far. The kingdom needs regional stability to fulfill its economic goals, but on the conflict, Saudi diplomacy has also to cope with a divided Arab world. And these divisions are both visible and subtle, also within the GCC. The Israel-Hamas war is also a challenge for regional de-escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, especially due to the role of Iranian-backed militias. On this point, it's curious that both Saudi Arabia and Israel, regardless the normalization issue, are now threatened by the same actors. Think, for instance, to the Houthis in Yemen and their repeated air and maritime attacks in the Red Sea. This is an interactive panel, so I invite you to submit your questions through the QA function of platform, and we will collect some of them for the final part of the webinar. Tobias, I would start with you. We saw Riyadh displaying a quite cautious position so far. Which kind of balancing act between the traditional pro-Palestinian stance of the kingdom and the frozen normalization process with Israel? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think, to be clear, this conflict, this war, comes at the worst possible time. I mean, obviously never good times for anything like this, but for Saudi Arabia, this really comes at the worst possible time. It flies completely in the face of the regional dynamic that I think Saudi Arabia wanted to see, and that Saudi Arabia was really bringing about, right? With all its diplomacy in the region, it was trying to encourage um, de-escalation trends. It was trying to encourage efforts to lower tensions, not just between itself and other countries in the region, but also between other countries in the region too. So that was its effort. Its effort was all about de-escalation and reducing tensions. And as part of that, of course, we also had its sort of engagement with normalization with Israel. Um, the other part is that this conflict sort of reveals all the flaws of the regional order that I think Saudi Arabia was worried about and has long been worried about, right? One is, it revives one of the oldest um, and most fraught conflicts in the region. That, from Saudi Arabia's perspective, um, one of the key characteristics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that it's a boon to exactly the kinds of forces that Saudi Arabia sees as destabilizing the region. It is the conflict that, from its perspective, actors like Iran, like other non-state actors, like terrorist organizations, uh, can exploit. That gives them fuel, that gives their narrative fuel. So, you know, and this conflict is obviously now revived. But also, this conflict reveals the sort of complex, shall we say, position of the United States in the region. The sort of uh, these question marks around what role the US plays in the region. It shows so clearly that at a time where the US is shifting from a position of being the hegemonic power in the region to one that remains the most powerful external actor, but one that's making an effort to sort of shift to a, shall we say, economy of force posture. Um, it reveals that the United States has as its main priority security of the state of Israel, uh, to almost to the exclusion of others' interests, and that, of course, is a problem for Saudi Arabia too. So, again, this conflict comes at the worst possible time, and it reveals key sort of worries about the regional order for Saudi Arabia. Now, that said, when it comes to the question of balancing between a traditional pro-Palestinian position and some form of relationship, eventual normalization with Israel, that is not new for Saudi Arabia. That's always been the case. And I think actually, in all that talk about normalization before October 7th, there was a tendency, certainly in the West, certainly in definitely in the US press, but also I think more generally, to downplay the extent to which the Palestinian issue was important for Saudi Arabia, the extent to which Saudi Arabia really did need some form of concession on the Palestinian question in any normalization talks. I think there was a tendency to downplay that and to sort of say, the Saudis ultimately just want to normalize, and they make all that stuff about Palestine is just rhetoric. I was always more skeptical of that narrative, and thought that the Palestinian issue is more important to Saudi Arabia than we might want to believe. But I think there's obviously no question that that the Palestinian question is absolutely front and center in any question of Saudi-Israel normalization. And that is a normalization that I think remains on the agenda. I think it is a bit further away, certainly, than it was 6 weeks ago or 7 weeks ago. But it certainly remains on the agenda. I think the fundamental interests that are driving those two countries together remain. You mentioned a couple of them earlier, in the sense of that Saudi Arabia and Israel have shared security interests. That, of course, remains the case. Some form of pragmatic engagement with Israel remains key to Saudi Arabia's economic plans. And so normalization remains on the agenda. The Palestinian issue has become more important to it. And I think it's become a more complex challenge for Saudi Arabia. It now, even more so than before October 7th, has as part of its challenge to normalize with Israel, also to find a new normalization with the Palestinians, a new engagement with a hopefully eventually renewed Palestinian leadership. I think that was part of Saudi Arabia's efforts before October 7th, and I think it will be part of Saudi Arabia's efforts going forward, trying to foster some form of Palestinian leadership that can be a genuine actor in a eventual peace process. Now, I know that whilst the war is going on, all of that might seem very far away and very far-fetched, but I think certainly at the strategic level, it makes sense to already think about those points.
Thank you. Yasmin, you recently wrote for Carnegie that, here I quote you, Israel opposes Saudi nuclear and armament ambitions and views the kingdom's normalization with Iran as a threat. But before October 7, we saw Saudi Arabia pursuing detente with Iran and normalization with Israel as two parallel processes. Do you think the Saudi-Iran rapprochement is at risk now due to the Israel-Hamas war, or do you still see room for advancing regional de-escalation? I think, for instance, to the recent meeting between the Iranian President Raisi and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh during the Arab League summit and the summit of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. What do you think?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to discuss those subjects with you. So I think that, and that's what's interesting about Saudi Arabia's balancing act. I think that just as Tobias said, just as the Israeli-Saudi normalization, it may be on ice but not over, I think we can say the same about the rapprochement and de-escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but it's actually not on ice. I think that if you watch what's happening, President Raisi and Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman, they spoke for the first time since the Beijing trilateral statement in March to discuss actually Gaza. They both have quite, I wouldn't say common, but at least very close position when it comes to trying to avoid the expansion of the war, which is something that is of utmost importance to Saudi Arabia, and where Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a major actor in. We also see that both of them, and honestly, that's something that also brings them even closer to the broker of the trilateral statement, which is China. Both of them oppose what is very obvious in this war, or became very obvious in this war to those countries, which is what they call the double standards of applying international law, international humanitarian law, the use of sanctions, the call for ceasefires. And in this, you would notice that actually the three of them, so China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, have close positions in asking that actually whatever was applied even to Saudi Arabia itself by the Biden administration when it came to the war in Yemen or other issues, the request or the demand that it applies also to Israel in its war against Gaza. We also, as you mentioned, saw that President Raisi's first visit to Riyadh since the normalization of the relations, and most importantly, since the Crown Prince became the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia and under King Salman, the first visit happened during that Arab Islamic Summit, again on Gaza. So I think this time what is different is that, at least from Riyadh's perspective, it is still trying to maintain the de-escalation in the region by actually trying to dialogue to keep the channels open with Iran. And in this instance, they both meet on opposing that expansion of the war, even if, of course, the narratives and the positions are not the same. So as I said, even though if you look at the Arab Islamic Summit's final declaration, or the OIC Summit Declaration, the language is not necessarily identical to what Saudi Arabia uses in its statements, even though we have seen the tone of Saudi Arabia increasing when it comes to reacting to Israeli actions in the war on Gaza. Saudi Arabia condemned, of course, the violence against Israeli civilians, whether in its own statements or in the statements within the Arab League. So the positions are not identical, but they are more open to rapprochement, to continuing the de-escalation than before. And I think from what we know of Saudi Arabia's foreign policy since 2015 is that there is always a very sharp focus on the ball and on the policy and on adapting or recalibrating the policy, but without losing the end game. And the end game here is, as was mentioned by you and Tobias, is to have the economic plans of Saudi Arabia and what is required for the success of these economic plans achieved, which means de-escalation and stability. Now, it doesn't mean that it's all rosy and it's going very well, because there are serious challenges. As you mentioned, the Houthis have been attacking in the Red Sea, and Saudi Arabia has the point of view that Iran can do more with the Houthis to put pressure on the Houthis than it's already doing. The same thing could apply to Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. That have also been targeting the US, but also declaring readiness to join in the fight of Gaza against Israel. And these are challenges. These are challenges on the Red Sea to the projects, the mega projects that Saudi Arabia has on the Red Sea, on the stability from the north and its borders with Iraq. And so I see that there are still challenges linked again to that Iranian presence in the region. But so far, it seems that the path chosen of de-escalation and of making that de-escalation work with Iran is still there.
Thank you, Yasmin. Tobias, beyond the current truce negotiated between Hamas and Israel and brokered by Egypt and most of all Qatar, all the GCC states agree upon the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. However, these states have displayed different positions on the war, and the different positions, especially on Hamas, even after October 7. I think, for instance, to Qatar, that in its first statement after October 7, claimed that the Israeli government was the only responsible for escalation. Taking into account this context, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is trying to play a leading diplomatic role, maybe with an eye also to the post-war, which is the big question mark for all. In your perspective, which are the challenges that Saudi Arabia are facing in order to build a political consensus on the conflict, even within the GCC?
I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that the GCC states have different positions when it comes to this current conflict. However, I think in the current dynamics, in the current regional dynamics, it's actually working out to be a good thing, at least for the moment. Obviously, we've already talked a lot about the de-escalation trend in the region. I think Yasmin just laid out really nicely what that means for the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. And I think we actually have a similar dynamic in the sort of intra-Gulf rapprochement, right? Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and the others too, all have their own positions. They're all their own, they all have their own interests. They're not just one cohesive bloc. They all have their own positions. Those positions don't necessarily all align, but we're now in an environment where that non-alignment doesn't always have to lead to conflict and competition, where there can be more pragmatic engagement and there can even be a level of complementarity. And I think that's actually where we are right now. Now, so so ultimately, the Hamas attack on the 7th of October and the war that has followed since have upended all the sort of normalization and de-escalation dynamics in the region, but those relationships are real. The relationships that have been built over the last 5 years, or rebuilt indeed, are real, and that has an impact in the sense that Mohammed bin Salman can now pick up the phone to Ibrahim Raisi in Tehran, and Sheikh Tamim in Qatar, and Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, and Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh can talk to each other in a more sort of frank and pragmatic way without it being beset by this wider regional competition that they found themselves in over the last 10 years or so. So I think where we are now is that the different positions are working out reasonably well for the moment, right? So Qatar has this position as the key actor that has that relationship with Hamas. And whilst this conflict is still ongoing, whilst Hamas is holding hostages, that position is really important and everyone needs it to exist. What happens after this conflict is over, once the fighting is over, I think that will be an interesting question, because at that point, I think a lot will be about to what extent Qatar retains that relationship with Hamas. And I think that will become a factor in Qatar's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE too. My expectation, sort of early assessment, would be that Qatar actually will be reasonably pragmatic when it comes to its relationship with Hamas going forward. So Qatar has that role, and I think the Saudis are very aware of that role and are very much encouraging it because they know it's needed. The UAE, on the other hand, is probably the Arab country Israel trusts most. So once we get to a point where there is going to be more about rebuilding Gaza, what happens after the war in Gaza. Now, I know all the Arab countries have made very clear that they are not prepared to sort of pick up the mess and provide security in the Gaza Strip after the conflict. That said, I think it's obvious that the UAE will be a really, really important interlocutor between Israel and the wider Arab world after the conflict. And I think, the Saudis recognize that too, as do the Qataris. You saw a couple of weeks ago, Sheikh Tamim traveling via the UAE to Egypt for a summit. So, all of those things I think are important. And from Saudi Arabia's position, I think it plays this big role as the regional convener. And I think you're absolutely right to note that Mohammed bin Salman clearly has this ambition. And quite frankly, I think he also perceives it as a duty, as Saudi Arabia's role. It doesn't have a choice to be the regional leader. That is simply its role. And it has to take on that responsibility. And I think it will. And in that process, it will continue to try to find a way to balance and use, where possible, the advantages that some of its neighbors in the region have. That doesn't mean that competition is out of the window, that competition couldn't become a problem once again. But I think for the moment, at least, there's some pretty encouraging signs.
Yes, I agree with you, Tobias, that as long as the escalation risk is real, complementarity between the GCC states is useful for political purposes, for trying to contain violence, and also to speak to the varied interlocutors, Qatar with Hamas, but maybe the UAE with the Israeli government. So this is also something to be taken into account. I would like to focus now on the economic implications of this war with regard to Saudi Arabia. Yasmin, you already started to outline the possible impact of this war on the economic goals of Saudi Arabia. Since before the Hamas attack against Israel, Saudi foreign policy was mainly economic oriented. since we know Riyadh needs regional stability to fulfill Vision 2030 targets. Do you think the Saudis are going to recalibrate now their regional posture because of the war or not? And which economic risk implications the war in Gaza can bring to the kingdom? I remember that in 2019, Saudi Arabia opted for a de-escalation policy after the unexpected attack against Saudi Aramco, the Iranian attack against Saudi Aramco. So in that case, there was a shift in its foreign policy from assertiveness, from polarization to a growing attention to regional de-escalation and also economic cooperation. Which is your assessment now? Sorry, Yasmin, you are muted in this moment.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Great. So as I said before, there are the general economic implications that are actually lived by all the countries in the region in general. I mean, foreign direct investors are always, reluctant to invest in a region where you have missiles and flying over, right? So as I said, on the Red Sea, not only the mega projects, but let's also remember that Saudi Arabia's flagship mega project is NEOM, and NEOM is actually not only on the Red Sea, but it's a few kilometers away from Israel. And actually, if you look at the plans for NEOM, they are all perfectly compatible for expanded and open economic relationship with Israel when it comes to, desalination technologies, in which Saudi Arabia, by the way, is very, very much advanced. I wouldn't say extremely, but very, very much advanced when it comes to EI, when it comes to technology. All these are fields that would welcome very much an open relationship with Israel that is becoming very hard now, because even though, as I said, the motivations behind either the de-escalation with Iran or the Saudi-Israel normalization deal is still there. So they didn't disappear from the Saudi agenda. And in that sense, if achieving those objectives still go through normalization with Israel and still go through de-escalation with Iran, these two policies are going to continue, but they are becoming harder. So today it would be very hard for Saudi Arabia, not only to discuss normalization, but even to continue, expanding the covert cooperation or the covert relations that it has been expanded quietly in a subtle way with Israel itself. As I said, for foreign direct investment, or though Saudi Arabia, again, in a continuation on that, focus on its objectives, despite different regional events or other distractions, held actually in October its International Investment Forum. Still, if again you have missiles flying over, investors wouldn't want to continue coming to the region. Again, if you think about the Houthis, and even because if you remember, in the height of the attacks of the Houthis on Saudi Arabia, they were actually expanding the attacks beyond the southern border, reaching, as you said, and again as claimed, whether the oil installations or the rest of the kingdom. So there are very real economic consequences for Saudi Arabia. Also, I would just like to rebound before getting, of course, to your question. There is also, it's not just going to be missiles or threats in the Red Sea, because the main reason for de-escalation with Iran is probably to continue, I wouldn't say convincing, but the dialogue with Iran on the necessity not to expand the war, and this expectation that Iran is going to exert its influence, not only on Hamas, on Hezbollah, on the militias in Iraq, but also in the Houthis, but Iran itself. But then Saudi Arabia doesn't have necessarily this kind of, let's say, incentives or motivations to give to the other side, which is Israel and which is the United States. At some point in this war, we were facing the real risk of escalation between Iran itself and these two countries, and which is something that Saudi Arabia can control, but will have to live with the consequences. So these are, these are the main challenges today. But I would also rebound on what Tobias said when it comes to relationship with other Gulf countries. It is absolutely obvious that at least they are trying to act in concert. At least there are consultations. At least there are talks. But also, I mean, I wouldn't count for vanished the competition between them. Because when you have, I think it was today or yesterday that the Lola Al-Khater from the Qatari Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was actually the deputy minister who was in Gaza. We should not underestimate the optics of this and the importance of this at a moment where the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is actually again back on the agenda of the Arab public opinions. Also the fact that, in the Saudi press and in some statements, not at all by officials, but we know how much, the public spaces are under control or under surveillance. You have seen articles saying that, Qatar with Israel have contributed to this empowerment of Hamas, which is something that we haven't heard from any Saudi official, of course, but it was in the Saudi press. So I think the competition is not over. The confrontation is, as you both mentioned. More, let's say, consultations are there, but also the competition is there. My final point would be to say that when it comes to Saudi Arabia, as you said, is the foreign policy going to change? Is it not going to be that much about economic interests? I don't think so. I think, again, that the Vision 2030, that national plan, is actually a very national project that is directly linked to the leadership and in which Saudi Arabia has been investing all of its resources. So I don't think that Saudi Arabia has the luxury of, putting it on the side. However, if you look at the repercussions on the oil markets, what are they going to be according to how the war is going on? We have seen the Saudis and other Gulf countries since the beginning saying we're not going to use oil as a weapon. And that's, again, because oil is, the main source of revenue still to feed into the diversification of the economy that has been, again, going pretty well for so far. So I don't think this is going to end, and it goes with, that new Saudi normative framework that still puts Saudi Arabia first. Even if starting 2019, Saudi Arabia has been more assuming its role or its place, I would say, not out of a sense of duty, but because it is a rewarding place to be the leader of the Middle East and especially of the Arab world. I think especially of all the books and the articles that came back after the end of the Cold War, and especially, a book by one of my mentors that explained how the United States has become, in the case of the US, an empire by default, by invitation, because everybody was going to the United States and saying, hey, there is this conflict, solve it. There is this problem, solve it. It is today the kind of the case with Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. You have other powers, traditional important powers, that are weakened either for domestic reasons or for geopolitical and geoeconomic reasons. And today you have everybody, knocking on the door of Saudi Arabia saying, okay, what are you going to do about Gaza? What are you going to do about the integration of Israel in the region? What are you going to do about, a Chinese Arab or Chinese Middle East relationships? What are you going to do about Egypt? What are you going to do about Jordan? And what are you going to do about Sudan, the Horn of Africa? So it is a country that is becoming, there is a demand for Saudi Arabia, and there's a realization in Riyadh that this is actually rewarding, that the Saudis are the ones who can bring the Palestinian Authority to the table, that the Saudis are the ones who can ask the Egyptian governments for economic reforms that are actually that the IMF, for example, has been asking on for a while. So I think, yes, definitely there is more conscious and more use of Saudi Arabia status that has been integrated into that Saudi Arabia first foreign policy.
Thank you, Yasmin. It's even more clear that economic and security goals are interrelated. First of all, for Saudi Arabia, they can't be separated. And this is something that remains despite this war. And this is something that Riyadh has to tackle also in the medium to long term. Tobias, I would like also to hear from you regarding the security implications for Saudi Arabia of the Israel-Hamas war, since we see, first of all, the Red Sea front that has emerged with the Houthis from Yemen repeatedly launching air and attacks towards Israel, and also performing piracy attacks against Israel-related vessels. Due to the geographical proximity, each time the Houthis try to attack Israel or an Israeli target, also Saudi Arabia and Saudi national security is threatened. How do you assess this, and do you think this front is going to negatively impact on Saudi-Houthi talks for a bilateral ceasefire in Yemen that are ongoing?
Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to just quickly agree with pretty much everything Yasmin said in terms of the outlook for Saudi foreign policy and the integration between foreign policy and economic policy. Look, I mean, when it comes to the sort of direct security implications of this current conflict on Saudi Arabia, the first is, as Yasmin said, the worry about this turning into a regional war clearly was the immediate worry. The driver of Saudi Arabia's immediate response, and it remains a worry, of course, even though the threat of this escalating into a regional war has been somewhat contained, I would suggest. The Red Sea front is a real nightmare for Saudi Arabia. It comes, these Houthi attacks on Israel, which they're not going to turn in. This is not a sort of big active front of this war that could be in any way, shape, or form comparable to what a Hezbollah Israel front could look like, and what ultimately what a Hezbollah Israel front currently looks like, right? Nevertheless, the Houthis clearly have signaled that they certainly consider themselves part of this conflict. And will fire the occasional missile to that effect. For Saudi Arabia, this comes just as it, I think, was pretty confident that it was on a good path towards reaching an agreement with the Houthis. And I think that actually remains the case, that there is now, more so than at any point probably over the last 8 years, quite a lot of optimism that an agreement between Riyadh and the Houthis could be imminent. The problem is that what these Houthi attacks against Israel demonstrate is that the Houthis are a bigger problem. They're not just a problem for Saudi Arabia bilaterally, but they're a real problem regionally. Because for Saudi Arabia, of course, it's really important to find some kind of solution to the Houthis being a threat to the kingdom itself. Their ability to fire missiles into Saudi Arabia, to conduct cross-border attacks, all of those things that, as Yasmin says, undermine any form of investor confidence there could be. That is, of course, something that has to be dealt with. Saudi Arabia tried the military route to militarily defeat the Houthis. I think it came to the conclusion that it was not able to do so. Now I think it is in the process of coming to a political arrangement with the Houthis. But the problem it then faces is that the Houthis' ability to pose a threat to things that are not directly related to Saudi Arabia, but for example, any form of shipping that the Houthis associate with Israel through the Red Sea, all of those kinds of things, undermine the stability of the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is ultimately absolutely crucial to what Saudi Arabia is trying to do with Vision 2030. I think to an extent, you can see Vision 2030 as an attempt to shift the sort of political center or economic political center of gravity of the kingdom from its east to its west, to the Red Sea coast, with NEOM, of course, being the sort of the big project. And for that, insecurity in the Red Sea is perhaps not quite deadly, but certainly not great. So I think there the Saudis will find that, yes, they might come to a bilateral agreement with the Houthis, but what then? And they'll have to figure out something more widely too. And I think that is also a sort of, an underlying dynamic of this whole conflict for Saudi Arabia itself. It's like the bilateral threat, the threat directly to the kingdom, is somewhat limited. But what this conflict, what the war in Gaza has the potential to do is to undermine regional stability and undermine some of the most sensitive parts of the regional order. It has the potential to undermine Egypt's stability, for example. It has the potential to undermine Jordan's stability. And both of those are absolutely crucial for Saudi Arabia and for Saudi Arabia's conception of what a stable region could and needs to look like for Vision 2030 to succeed. And it goes even bigger than that. I spoke at the very beginning of this event about Saudi Arabia's view of how the United States is sort of positioning itself, Saudi Arabia's view of how other external actors might play a role. We've seen some of this discussion about Saudi Arabia looking to China to play a more significant role in regional diplomacy and all of those kinds of aspects. So all of that feeds into this. This conflict right now is one that I think on the one hand shows up all the fundamental flaws and problems and intractable problems of the regional order as we've known it for the last 80 years or so. And it reveals the challenges for building a regional order in which this Vision 2030, this national project that the kingdom is pursuing, can fit. And as Yasmin says, Saudi Arabia is the regional leader. Yes, it wants that role, but with being that regional leader, you also then you have to try to shape the region around you in order to develop itself. There is no alternative to it.
Thank you, Tobias. And also, the deterrence has not been working against the Houthis attacks, nor the presence of the U.S. Military in the Red Sea. While, on the contrary, this is maybe emboldening the Houthis to trying to enhance their political position in Yemen and also in the region through military attacks. And this is a problem also for Saudi Arabia that is increasingly relying also on a petrol line, the East-West pipeline, to export its oil through the Yanbu oil terminal and the Red Sea route as an alternative to the Hormuz Strait. But we are testing that this is not a safe route that must be taken for granted, not at all. I would like to ask you a couple of questions from our public. I would start with Yasmin with a question on Saudi-US relations. After October 7, are they stronger or weaker than before? Taking also into account that the normalization process with Israel was also part of a broader renegotiation of the Saudi-US alliance, with also a security defense pact and a cooperation on on nuclear energy for civilian purposes. And then a question for Tobias on Saudi leadership and most of all the public perception of Saudis with regard to Hamas. If you want to add some reflections on this. Yasmin, would you like to start with?
Sure. I mean, if you look, let's assess this in terms of quantity versus quality, right? So I think in terms of quantity, they are definitely closer because, as I said, Saudi Arabia may not be present on the ground in Gaza, might not have direct relations with Israel to influence Israel, but it is the main and the major Arab actor. So today we see it, part or at least leading with Egypt, that delegation that goes, through the P5 and major European powers that also went to China and Russia, that was mandated by the Islamic and Arab summit that took place in Riyadh. Right, we saw also Saudi Arabia, again, within that framework of Saudi first approach, it didn't cancel its Saudi Africa summit. And within that framework, it also championed the Palestinian cause, giving itself even more weight. And all this is very important for the United States because Saudi Arabia remains a major power. So in terms of quantity, if you want, of interactions, of visits, of calls, of discussions on, as was mentioned, what is going on right now in Gaza, but what is going to happen after the war in terms of platforms. The quantity is definitely, confirming a closer relationship. But when you look at the quality of it, again, I think there is an underestimation of how much the U.S. position is not only embarrassing, but also perceived as kind of shocking in Riyadh. Not because, the United States has always traditionally supported Israel, but because, as Tobias mentioned, it is very detrimental to Saudi interests. So again and again, it is confirmed that in the balance, Saudi interests are not taken into consideration by the United States, are not taken into account. And as I said, we shouldn't underestimate that, normative impact of how much the Biden administration's, yes, it has shifted its narrative on Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't mean that Riyadh forgot that, all those American condemnations of Saudi Arabia's conduct of war that are now today completely ignored when it comes to Israel's war in Gaza, at a time, as I said, where this is becoming a very crucial issue, or the major issue for regional public opinions, but also in the international order in general. So I think that they are closer, but it highlighted what is at the root of their differences, of why every once in a while you have a crisis in the relationship. Because there isn't basically, and this is what I wrote in my article for Carnegie, there is a difference in how the United States treats its different allies, and I don't think that this is today is welcomed in Riyadh, to be seen as a collateral damage, if you want, or some of its interests be seen as collateral damage, even if, and that's also a fact, that Saudi Arabia has never been a fan of Hamas, that Saudi Arabia doesn't support, Islamist factions, but the ongoing war and the U.S. position is detrimental to Saudi cooperation with the U.S., with Israel, and to its, of course, as you mentioned, its regional and economic interests, because that issue of logistics is of major importance. Saudi Arabia has a national project and a plan to become a logistical hub. The Middle East corridor that was still, under study in Saudi Arabia is now, kind of hard to achieve. And as you very well mentioned, Eleonora, that perception that the Red Sea could be kind of a safety network for the Gulf when it comes to the shipping. Well, this is putting an end to that. There is the most populous Arab country, which is Egypt, that in addition to its dire economic situation, is now, has a security issue, and the Saudis are called upon to again contribute to stabilizing that area. So there is a perception that all of this is not seen in Washington when making the calculations about this war.
Thank you, Yasmin. Tobias, how do you see Saudi public perception of Hamas? From the public, it was stressed the interview that Khaled Meshallah, the former leader of Hamas, gave to Al Arabiya, and the quite critical reaction of the journalist who was interviewing.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's no surprise and certainly no secret that there's no love lost between the Saudi leadership and political elite and Hamas. And I don't necessarily think that it's particularly different in terms of public opinion either. I don't think there's this strong Saudi support for Hamas. However, I think what we're actually seeing is that the war, certainly the war starting on October 8th to today, is not necessarily just perceived as a war by Israel against Hamas. It's perceived as a war by Israel against the Palestinians. And for the Palestinians, there's obviously very strong public support. And I think that is one of the challenges that Arab countries across, or governments across the Arab world are dealing with, that their political position as governments vis-a-vis Hamas is fairly clear. They don't like them. However, they know that nuance between we support the Palestinians, but we don't support Hamas, is lost at the level of public opinion. And at the level of public opinion, like I said, this is perceived as a war against the Palestinian people. And all the nuances kind of go away. And that's something that governments across the region have to deal with, and Saudi Arabia does too. I think what you mentioned there, that the interview with Khaled Mashal and the sort of the editorial line, is certainly, one attempt to bring some of that nuance into the public discourse. But, with the images that people are in the Middle East and around the world are confronted with on a day-to-day basis coming out of Gaza, trying to introduce that kind of nuance into the debate is a pretty big challenge.
Thank you, Tobias. To sum up a brief our conversation, we agree upon the fact that Saudi strategic agenda hasn't changed so much after October 7 and the start of the Israel-Hamas war, but we know that for Saudi Arabia it will be even more difficult than before to achieve both its economic and security goals that are really interlinked. Thank you very much to our speakers for sharing ideas, for joining us today. Thank you to Tobias Bork and Yasmin Farouk. For our audience, I remember that the next webinar ISPI will host will be on Iran, decoding Iran's position on the Gaza war on November 30. So let's stay with us, and goodbye.